Estamos
Nastassja Pugliese, quien es profesora en la Universidad Federal de Río de Janeiro. Y bueno, es un honor tenerte con nosotros, Nastassja. No sé si te parezca bien comenzar entonces. Muchas gracias.
Sí. Gracias a usted. Voy a hablar en inglés. Tengo un pequeño PowerPoint. ¿Puedo compartir?
Sí, doctora, sin problema.
Sí, Brian, gracias.
¿Pueden ver, oírme?
Sí.
Sí.
Entonces, comienzo. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you, Teresa Gonzalez, for the organization and the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be speaking in the Seminario de Investigadores at one of the most important and traditional universities of Latin America, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. It's such an honor. Thank you. Well, this research that I will present here today is the first chapter of a short book that I'm writing on Nisia Floresta that is under contract with Cambridge University Press for the Cambridge Element series on the women in the history of philosophy, edited by Jacqueline Broad. The book has 2023 as an initial release date, so I'm not only in the middle of my writing process, but this is the first time that I will publicly talk about the book and its content. I'll be basically telling you stories here, so this might not sound like your regular philosophy talk. Anyway, the book is an introduction to what I consider to be the main contribution of Nisia Floresta to the history of philosophy, her critique of colonialism through her appropriation of practical Cartesianism. My talk has 6 short parts, but since Floresta is largely unknown, I will start by answering who she is, and this will take a little longer. So, Floresta and the Brazilian Enlightenment. Nisia Floresta is the pseudonym of Dionisia Gonçalves Pinto, and she's from a very prolific period in the development of Brazilian philosophy. As other women like her, she was writing outside academia and for the general public. She was born in 1810. Brazil was still a colony of the Kingdom of Portugal, so 12 years before Brazil's independence. And she passed away in 1885, some 4 years before the country became a republic, and also 4 years before the abolition of the institution of slavery. She's a post-colonial thinker in this temporal sense. Floresta is writing during a period that is immediately after Brazil ceases to be a colony of Portugal and was constructing itself as an independent nation. So it is a moment of nation building. That's why we can find nationalist themes in her writings as well. She can also be categorized as a romantic thinker, although she advances a very pessimistic romanticism. Floresta witnessed historical events that shaped modern history, both in the new and the old world, such as, for example, the construction of the nation states, the poverty and lack of social rights, workers' rights, in an era that was optimistic about industrialization and the scientific revolution. On her writings, and she wrote more than 12 books and various essays on the press, she offers a cultural critique of modernity, a critique that, as I show during this presentation, is a sort of a corollary of the application of Cartesian principles cultural analysis, consequences following from the utilization of key philosophical ideas to the study of the concrete case of Brazilian post-colonial society. Her books have been translated to French and Italian. There is an essay in English as well during the 19th century. And it is said that one essay on moral education, the Concilia Mia Filia in Italian, has been indicated a local bishop for adoption in an Italian Catholic school to be part of its curriculum. She was a school director, having held a school for girls with progressive curriculum, teaching not only arithmetics, but also geography, history, and foreign languages by immersion. Her school was criticized by the local elite. We can find a critique published in a local newspaper, and as Rio de Janeiro was the capital of Brazil at the time, local news in Rio sort of spread everywhere, and this means national news. So they call her pedagogical project problematic due to the lack of usefulness of those topics that were being taught at her school, history, advanced mathematics, languages, for they were a hindrance to the upbringing of future wives and mothers. Floresta was a public figure who was aware that she was writing for a large, non-specialized audience. Most of her writings have been published as essays on the press and later organized as chapters and published in book form. With the democratization of the printing press in Brazil after its independence in 1822, a number of newspapers were created by women dealing with topics related to morals behavioral expectations, women's roles in society, and their rights. Floresta participated in what Palhares Burke calls our mini querelle des femmes, on a to-be-published chapter that is already online in the form of a YouTube video talk that you can look out for, because it was the opening conference of the Vozes, Mulheres na História da Filosofia, a conference that I organized at UFRJ earlier this year. So Palhares Burke, she calls this period that happened in Brazil in the first half of the 19th century our mini querelle des femmes, a moment where Brazilian women were engaging in the press with the problem of inequality between the sexes and envisioned education as an instrument of emancipation. Other women intellectuals of a certain social class, obviously, were part of this movement. Many of them are still to be retrieved from historical oblivion and studied philosophically. From Teresa Margarida Silva e Horta, Ana de Barandas, Cisca Senhorinha da Mota Diniz, Maria Firmina dos Reis, Josefina Álvares de Azevedo to Emília de Freitas, all these women writers and readers of newspapers were part of what one of them, Francisca Diniz, editor of her own newspaper, named the Age of Enlightenment in Brazil. She was referring to their own Enlightenment movement, the Enlightenment put forward by Brazilian learned women. Nisia Floresta was a major influence in this text because of a translation she made when she was 22 years old, described by her as a free translation of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. Floresta's translation, Direitos, as I will call it, is attributed by the translator herself to Mistress Godwin, Wollstonecraft's married name. It is written on the front page that Direitos is a free translation from Wollstonecraft's work. And the secondary literature, readers and interpreters of Floresta until today describe her as the translator of Wollstonecraft and attribute the ideas that were spread through this book in Brazil and Latin America to Wollstonecraft. There are also people who call her the Brazilian Wollstonecraft. So the full name of the book is Direitos das Mulheres e as Injustiças dos Homens, is read by many as a turning point for women's consciousness and openness to denounce oppression. And as Lima Duarte says, it was a woman claim for rights in a context where women only had duties. Until today, the appearance of this book in the public sphere is incorrectly read as being the insertion in the Brazilian and Latin American context of Wollstonecraft's ideas. For example, on the 2017 anthology, Essential Feminist Reader, that displays a collection of feminist essays from various contexts showing feminism from a global perspective, we can see that the translation of Wollstonecraft is referred to as a major intellectual event shaping feminist discussions of the time. You can see in this short note that precedes Francisca Senhorinha Mota Diniz essay on equality of rights that 10 years after Brazil became an independent nation in 1822, a translation of Wollstonecraft, Vindication of the Rights of Women, appeared there, right? And then there is this whole story about urban women that led feminist journals and questioned all sorts of oppressions that they were suffering. So the fact is that it is not the case that 20th century early feminists were discussing Wollstonecraft's ideas through Floresta translation. Similarly, on the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, one can see another, more recent interpretation saying that Direitos is an authorial book of Floresta, mixing influences of Olympe de Gouges, Sofia, and Mary Wollstonecraft. But this version is also does not know the origin of the book clearly enough. So first, Direitos was considered to be a translation of Wollstonecraft, and now there is this idea that the book Direitos is a book written by an author book of Floresta that is a sort of a mix of influences of Deguch, Sofia, and Wollstonecraft. But this is not the case, because Floresta translated to Portuguese a French book edited by César Gardeton, who, by his turn, had done a French translation of an English work. Gardeton, who edited the French translation of the English work, misattributed the authorship of the book to Wollstonecraft, and Floresta just passed the mistake along in translation to Portuguese. Well, both Gardeton and Floresta were translators, not of the Vindications, but of the book Women Not Inferior to Men, one of a series of radical feminist pamphlets published anonymously in Britain during the 18th century. This book, which is actually a pamphlet, is signed by Sofia, a person of quality, but we know that this is a pseudonym. This discovery, that Direitos was actually a direct translation of the Sofia pamphlets, was made by the Brazilian scholar Maria Lúcia Palhares Burke in 1995, 150 years after the translation was first published. And then Eileen Boutin and Charlotte Matthews in 2017, very recently, investigated the material history of the translation and figured out that it was not Floresta who misattributed the authorship, but Gardeton, and she only carried the mistake along. My work follows Palhares Burke and Boutin and Matthews' lead, as I try to sort out the theoretical consequences of the fact that Direitos is a translation of Sofia. So this is the context in which the topic of this talk is inserted. One immediate consequence is the fact that 19th century Latin American feminism has a strong Cartesian influence. And this is because the original work that had been translated, the radical feminist pamphlet from the pamphlet wars in Britain during the 18th century, carries arguments from Poulain de la Barre, who was himself a Cartesian. But before we get there, I want to say a little bit more about Sofia and the Sofia pamphlets. But actually, before I talk about the Sofia pamphlet, I just want to show you that instead of being a free translation of a work, Direitos, the first published work of Nisia Floresta, is actually a direct translation, or if not direct in the sense of being technically precise, because, if we put the text one on the side of the other, on the left, you can see Sofia pamphlet, the Sofia pamphlets, the opening sentences of the Sofia pamphlet. And on the right, you can see the opening sentences of Direitos, Nisia's translation. You see that it's perfectly the same, although sometimes Floresta sort of tones down a little bit of the anger that one can find in Sofia pamphlets. For example, instead of calling someone who does not understand something an idiot, she calls this person someone that lacks good sense, falta de bom senso. And instead of talking about lordly creatures, she talks about entes. So, but the fact is that if you put one text on the side of another, you see that it's exactly the same text. So Floresta translated the Sofia pamphlets directly. It's not that she's altering the arguments or the content. So the Sofia pamphlets. As Guillaume Leduc in a 2015 paper says, the long 18th century in Britain that springs from 1688 to 1815 was the golden age of patriarchy, when there was an institutionalized male dominance over women and children. Women were propertyless and were themselves considered as property of their husbands and fathers. At this time, there was a revival of the Querelle des Femmes in a response for an article published by Lord Chesterfield on a newspaper called Common Sense, or the Englishman's Journal, in 1738. In 1739, that is 1 year later, Sofia the Anonymous published a pamphlet entitled Women Not Inferior to Men, which became the reference in discussions on women's rights and was quickly translated to other languages. This happened more than half a century before the publication of Vindications by Wollstonecraft. On this first pamphlet, and there is a series of 3, she discussed the alleged rational inferiority of women and the superiority of men, enumerating various commonsensical views on the limitations of women and criticizing one and each of them. For example, their ability to hold public offices, to be part of the military, to hold chairs in universities, and to learn and teach the sciences. So their capacity to access higher education. Scholars do not know who Sofia is, although there has been some rumor that she could have been Mary Wortley Montagu, which is not certain and far from settled. There are other hypotheses that she could have been Madeleine d'Arçon de Puisieux, but some say that Madame de Puisieux didn't know English, so she couldn't have translated. She couldn't have written the pamphlet. She was a French woman. And there's another hypothesis that Sofia could have been just a myriad of women writing together under the pseudonym of Sofia. Of course, there are also those who consider that this pamphlet could not have been written by a woman, and that was probably a man that was writing behind the pseudonym of a woman. But there is a lot of, there are some evidences that Sofia could have been Mary Wortley Montagu, because she created a newspaper called The Nonsense of Common Sense. Remember that Lord Chesterfield newspaper was called The Common Sense? So Mary Wortley Montagu created a newspaper, The Nonsense of Common Sense, to publish articles that were directly against those of Lord Chesterfield. So that's one reason why scholars take her as a possible person behind the Sofia pamphlets. But that's not settled at all. And I think that it's important to keep Sofia as an anonymous, right? So although we do not know Sofia's identity, we know her social rank. She's a person of quality. We know that she was a young lady, and we know her addressees. They were both men and women, because she wanted to be read by men. And we know that she was highly influenced by the English translation of Poulain de la Barre's Égalité des deux sexes, published in 1673, translated 4 years later in 1677 by Lovell as The Woman as Good as the Man, or The Equality of Both Sexes. The influence of Poulin's argument in the Sofia pamphlets were so great that the pamphlet was considered to be a work plagiarizing Poulin. This is certainly an unfair accusation, because if we understand what is a pamphlet, so if the pamphlet is understood in context, then that is, what is the context, right? The pamphlet was produced in the midst of an argument war using the printing press. So in the context of an argument war, Sofia used Poulin as a tool. Because of this accusation of plagiarism, Sofia was not very much studied. And I also think it's because of the fact that she's an anonymous. But, you know, the retrieval of Sofia as a thinker is recent in the philosophical context. So the Sofia's pamphlet, Women Are Inferior to Men, is then a text that builds upon Poulain de la Barre's strategies on equality. Poulain inaugurates the tradition of practical Cartesianism, that is, the application to the social sphere, to the political dimension, of metaphysical and epistemological principles taken from Cartesian philosophy. Labarre is considered as a Cartesian feminist, as he inaugurated the tradition of using Cartesianism for liberatory purposes. As Pellegrin in 2019 chapter would remind us, using Cartesian ideas and applying it to feminist purposes is not the same as claiming that Descartes himself was a feminist. And I think that this is an important point to make. And that the relevant thing here being that Cartesianism, that is the readings of Descartes' philosophy, bears strong connections between feminism and his philosophy for both theoretical and practical reasons. And it is Pellegrin herself who states that, and I quote, "The Cartesianism of Poulain is a practical Cartesianism." So she's the one who carves this concept of practical Cartesianism. So this is from where I take the expression that I use. And if Poulin's feminism is a Cartesian feminism due to the use of women's issues as a study case of the effectiveness of Cartesian ideas, then Sofia is a Cartesian feminist as well. And trivially, as Direitos is a translation of Sofia, Floresta is also influenced by practical Cartesianism. That's the first consequence of the fact that Direitos is a translation of Sofia. Now, the practical Cartesianism of Poulain de Labarre. Some take that Cartesian feminism is based on the practical application of basically two ideas: the method of doubt and the consequences of the mind-body distinction. That is, if mind and body are separate and mind is autonomous, having its principle of motion springing from itself, then it means that intelligence has no sex and men and women have basically the same kind of mind. Jacqueline Broad, in a 2017 paper, criticizes common generalizations about Cartesianism and feminism by showing that the method of doubt is a skeptical tool that is unable to establish positive truths. And it is a tool that is supposed to come to an end with the cogito. I agree with Broad that there are quick generalizations on the relationship between Cartesianism and feminism, but there has been some powerful consequences of doubting tradition as a methodological principle, and also in dealing with the consequences of the claim that the mind has no sex, being Floresta's opúsculo one such case. Nevertheless, I also agree with Dorlan's 2000s book, a book from the 2000s from Dorlan, who reads that Poulain is part of a broader movement that she calls the féminisme logique, which included other authors such as Marie de Gournay, Gabrielle Souchon, and Anna Maria van Schurman. Dorlan considers that these thinkers are connected by their method, which is not reduced to Cartesianism, as they did not use the rhetoric of clear and distinct ideas, and not necessarily Cartesian ideas. But these thinkers were interested in the general application of logical strategies to deal with misogynistic arguments and to show that defenses on inequality were wrong. This logical method is clearly present in Direitos, Floresta's translation of Sofia, to the point that one can use her writings to teach critical thinking, basic logical concepts, and argument structures, as Professor Gisele Seco and I argued on a to-be published chapter on Floresta. It's very clear the bits of syllogisms are sort of there for us to use to our pleasure. However, and I think that highlighting this is very important, there is a variety of expressions of Cartesianisms and of logical tests to misogynistic arguments in the writings of this period. So we can say that practical Cartesianism is one instance of logical feminism. The way practical Cartesianism expresses itself in the translation Direitos, Floresta's first publication, and in the Opúsculo, her major and now authorial work, is the issue that I'll deal with in the remainder time of my talk. So, direitos das mulheres e as injustiças dos homens. As you can see, Mistress Godwin appears there on the cover of the paper. I will now talk briefly about direitos, insofar as it is the translation of the Sofia Pamphlets. The book is an exercise in extracting the consequences of the thesis that the mind has no sex, and therefore all the observed inequalities between men and women have been socially constructed. So it opens with the traditional claim that there is nothing so admirable than the fact that men are capable of wonder. But instead of, like Aristotle in the Metaphysics, claiming that wonder leads the spirit to philosophize over nature and natural phenomena, the argument goes on to defend that the object which is most prone to wonder is the power of custom over the spirit, or the power of prejudice in guiding our actions. Then there follows a sequence of syllogisms to deny the thesis that men are naturally superior to women, and to defend that men are made to exercise dominance, not because they are naturally superior, but out of tyrannical authority that depends upon demanding from women their servitude. On the one hand, and that's the argument that appears in the opening, in the first chapter of Direitos. On the one hand, if men were superior in their bodily strength, they would not make use of their power against those who have a lower and more fragile constitution. This would be a sign of weakness, of a weaker mind, for reason should have made them ashamed of subordinating their bodies to ambition and lower passions. On the other hand, if men were superior in their mental strength, they would not subjugate women, as rational privilege would make them generous, not violent and boastful. Women, on their turn, recognize that they have reason and rational capacities that can be considered to be even superior to men's, since they're capable of convincing men even when law is not acting on their favor. By using reason, women see men as led by ambition and inclinations that are common to the brutes. That's the spirit of Direitos, a book full of bits of syllogisms grounded on the principle of equality of the minds. Basically, on the idea then that men and women can use reason in the same way, in an attempt to demonstrate the thesis that physical differences between the sexes do not justify political inequality, and that rational equality indicates that all inequality in terms of intellectual expression is due to lack of access to formal education and to unjust laws that favor men over women. The book then assumes certain Cartesian metaphysical theses, such as that of the independence of the intellect over the body, and proceeds with a series of deductions to defend women's rights to hold public offices, to access and teach at universities, to hold property, and to have the best possible kind of education. What is specific of direitos is not present and what is specific of direitos and is not present on the Sofia pamphlets is the dedication on its opening pages. Floresta addresses the Brazilian women and the Brazilian male academics so they can visit the question of the rights of women and their access to good education so that justice towards the female sex can be made. So actually, Floresta translates the work into Portuguese and she dedicates it to the Brazilian women and to Brazilian male academics. And there is a full page on the dedication where she justifies why she's making this translation and why the book should be read. Through her exercise in translation in Direitos, Floresta brings to post-colonial Brazil the highly heated debate on the equality of the sexes and women's rights. The fact that Direitos is a translation and not Floresta's original work makes scholars consider how connected her philosophical views are with the arguments on the radical British pamphlet. Charlotte Matthews, in a 2011 book, for example, she considers that Floresta has toned down in her later works, becoming a more conservative intellectual. My claim is that the Opúsculo Humanitário is Floresta's own exploration of the same strategy present in Direitos, that is, her own test of those Cartesian theses, natural equality of rational capacities, and the application of the skeptical method, through the analysis of the social context of 19th century Brazil. 1 minute. So my concluding argument here is very simple. I want to demonstrate that Floresta's major work, the Opúsculo Humanitário, is a development of ideas found in Direitos. More specifically, I want to say that in the Opúsculo, Floresta puts practical Cartesianism to test by analyzing how modern civilizations do not mirror the theoretical equality advanced by their Enlightenment thinkers. Most especially, how colonization is at odds with the principle of natural equality resulting from the Cartesian cogito. The OH, the Opúsculo Humanitário, and again, Nisia Floresta, Nisia Floresta is a pseudonym, right, of Dionisia Gonçalves Pinto. So the Opúsculo Humanitário is signed by B.A. only, as Brasileira Augusto. She signs the different books with different variations of her pseudonym. So the Opúsculo Humanitário is, I'm just kind of explaining the image that you can see here on screen. The Opúsculo Humanitário is composed of 62 essays that had been first published on a local newspaper. So, you know, we have to see and interpret those chapters, not as chapters on a book exactly, but as articles on a newspaper. So she was addressing a large audience. The main topic of the book is women's education. But more than just claiming that women have the natural abilities to be able to excel in the arts and sciences, Floresta wants to show how colonization influences learning, creating a culture that is not conducive for the integration of women to society as real subjects, as says Peggy Sharp on the opening edition of Opúsculo Humanitário, an edition from 1989. So not conducive for women and an impediment for indigenous people and enslaved Black persons, as they are not recognized as owners of their own body, of their own rationality, and of their capacity to make choices. According to Nisia Floresta, Black enslaved people, indigenous people, and Brazilian women are all subject to domination on different levels, of course. Their marginal social status result from the fact that there are people who benefit from the lack of recognition of their dignities, continuing to cause their mental and physical pain. On the Opúsculo, Floresta is able to articulate the operating principle of colonialism, showing how colonization plays a large role in shaping the subjectivity of people being part of one's sense of self. So colonization sort of gets ingrained in one's sense of self. It defines someone's sense of self. And she also sort of describes the operating principle of colonialism And she describes the operating principle as just suffering. Colonizers use others as instruments, forcing them to act by causing them pain, and in some cases, even through torture. And because these experiences of exploitation and naturalization of suffering become ingrained in the culture, Floresta offers a proposal for an education that is able to restore the dignity of those that don't have. And that's what is humanitarian in the Opúsculo Humanitário. Opúsculo is a small work. It can be described as a kind of pamphlet as well. So in this sense, Opúsculo Humanitário can be read as Floresta's own pamphlet. So it's like a small humanitarian work. And what is humanitarian about the Opúsculo is this idea that education should be able to restore the dignity of those that don't have. So she's looking for a way to humanize people and culture through education. I think it's also important to say that she's not only thinking formal education in the sense of the education that we receive on formal institutions. She's thinking about the education we receive at home and through culture. So a change in education means a change in culture. Otherwise, it's not sufficient. It's not enough to restore dignity. That's why one consequence of this idea is that Floresta has to be an abolitionist, and she has to defend the right of indigenous people for their lands. If she is really committed to this idea to this humanistic idea of recognizing the dignity and humanity in each and every person, regardless of their race and nationality. So the central thesis of the Opúsculo is that the education of women is a measure of civilizational progress. So any society that does not care for the intellectual development of women and does not create the proper conditions for its flourishing is not a society that can call itself civilized. And if women are not given the proper conditions, this is an indication that all other social groups that have marginal social status in society are not given as well. So in a context of colonization, based on exploitation and dominion over certain groups that are left out of the legal protection of citizenship, it is impossible to have the proper conditions of civil development. The principle at stake is that natural equality should be mirrored in civil laws. If not, then there will be barbarism, not civilization. So practical Cartesianism put to test, and that's the concluding moment of my talk. So I presented an overview of Opúsculo, and now I will conclude reinforcing in which sense the thesis that colonialism is at odds with civilization and that women's education is a measure of civilization are theses that follow from putting practical Cartesianism to test. So first, Floresta is explicit in attributing to Descartes the opening of a new era in philosophy, where women are able to be recognized by their deeds without being burned at the stake. So she says, and this is on the Opúsculo, after Descartes has opened a new era to philosophy, the French women no longer remained limited to the examples of courage given by Joan of Arc when she had the glory of freeing her fatherland. Other virtues, other triumphs of which women are more deserving took place, distinguishing the French women of our days. The new era that has been opened to philosophy is one in which women participate in the public sphere and are recognized by their contributions. This is possible because of the strength of the thesis that the intellect is not limited by the physical constitution of the body, where the mind inhabits. For Floresta, individuals are minds in bodies, where the mind, if well educated, becomes free, and by knowing its relationship with others, acts with generosity. So this is a print from the Opúsculo, and it said that it was due the reason given by some to prevent women from studying was its physical weakness. But it's not the physical weakness that, but it's not the physical nature that makes men superior, but the intelligence. And then she cites Voltaire, Racine, Pascal, and others who were weak, but at the same time were intelligent men. And then she says she offers, she explicitly writes this practical Cartesianism thesis, right? An intelligence that has no sex can be equally superior in women. And then she says that it's not as superior as it could be because women are prevented from having a good quality education. So that's an evidence of what I'm talking about. So, and then again, another quote that evidences what I'm talking about. She says, the education of women has a powerful influence on the morality of cultures, and their education is the most noticeable trait of civilization in a nation. So the education of women is sort of a sort of measure of civilization. In the beginning of the Opúsculo, she writes this mini, quick, but very powerful social history of women from ancient times to the 19th century. And she offers a catalog of women that have been important in different civilizations. And the purpose of this opening of the Opúsculo Humanitário is to actually show that civilizations, that nations that we consider highly civilized were actually not civilized enough because of the way they treated women. So it's part of like an argument by induction, right? She's enumerating the examples of civilization and showing that unless women are well educated, these places or these cultures cannot be called civilized. So the test then that Floresta poses to practical Cartesianism is the extrapolation of the women's situation as a case study to its application to other groups. So, for example, the benevolent action should not work just for the recognition of women as a cogito, but the benevolent action, insofar as it is an action that recognizes the humanities of others, should be directed to indigenous groups and Black enslaved persons as well. In this sense, a culture of exploitation and suffering based on the expropriation of the lands of native people and on forcing others to act by enslaving them is not a culture grounded on equality. And any enforcement of this kind of relationship counts against civilizational development. Consequently, when a nation colonizes another, the principle of equality is broken, for it should hold for humans of every race and every nationality. So I'll read one more paragraph here. If intelligence has no sex and all inequality is due to socially constructed strategies of denying women high quality learning and their capacity to express their intelligence publicly, then if a nation does not create the conditions for the flourishing of the female sex, then this is an indication of a failure to observe equality more generally. As a most notable trait of civilization, the level of education of women, when low, counts as a sign that natural equality is not mirrored in the civil law or in the cultural habits. Floresta is clear when describing that Brazil's neglect with the education of women is due to colonization and the culture that has been enforced by the Portuguese colonizers. For her, they were too worried with conquests and too carried by their triumphs that they spread the wrong idea that women do not need any other knowledge beside those that make them utile servants of the household. And this is the quotation. It is a sad truth that Brazil has inherited from its colonizers, the neglect that they always had with the education of women. The Portuguese carrying their guns and their campaigners to other regions of the world, exploring the glory of uniting these forces that they knew well how to employ to subjugate other nations, would get too inebriated in their great triumphs to be concerned, as they should have, to the instruction of women. Women who, according to the opinion of the majority of people in their country, do not need any other knowledge besides those that make them be the first and most utile servant of their household. And this are, so practical Cartesianism, if it is to be used as a tool for thinking the social dimension, should tell us to protect indigenous autonomy, to observe racial equality, and treat everyone with dignity. A nation that calls itself enlightened and colonizers and slaves, a nation that calls itself enlightened, but are colonizers and slaves, is not an enlightened nation. It's not a civilized nation. Practical Cartesianism, if it's supposed to pass the test of colonial analysis, should serve as a liberating tool from traditional habits and beliefs that the colonizers enforce on the emerging culture. It should serve to help us unlearn the lessons of colonialism. So these are two extracts that show that Floresta is concerned with the indigenous cause. She has actually a long poem called A Lágrima de Caeté, a poem that was edited twice. It had 2 editions. It's when she was alive, and it's a poem about the indigenous situation during the Praieira Revolution. So she says, this is a sentence that is supposed to be said by an indigenous Caeté in Brazil. To the domination of oppressive tyrants that in the name of the pious heaven came to take the possessions that heaven bestowed on us, our wives, our daughters, our peace have stolen from us, bringing from across the oceans the law, the vices, putting away our laws and our traditions. So this is on an indigenous book, on an indigenous poem written by Floresta. And on the right side, this little piece is also present in the Lágrima de Caeté, is being said by the indigenous Caeté in the poem, but then she uses this very same part of the poem to put on the mouth of Black enslaved people in the Opúsculo Humanitário. So she uses this very same thesis for the indigenous and Black enslaved people. So in the Opúsculo, it appears as the voice of a Black enslaved person saying, God who no race made to have over another revolting superiority, unlimited pleasure. Showing that practical Cartesianism, if it is to be used as a tool for thinking the social dimension, should tell us to protect indigenous autonomy and observe racial equality and treat everyone with dignity. So finally, I think that when we add Floresta to the canonical narrative, we see that modern history of philosophy, it is not always the heroic narrative of the enlightened man who did the scientific revolution, the Reformation, changing political regimes with the sword of reason, equality, and fraternity. That this history is also marked by the institution of slavery and colonization, expropriation of indigenous lands, and erasure of their culture. From 16th to the 19th century, there were various attempts, and successful ones, to dehumanize others. And there were other voices on the Enlightenment that did not ignore these horrific events and tried to push the principle of equality to test by showing that either there is a radical implementation or there is no possible meaning for civilization. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And now we have some time for Q&A. So you can raise your hand, and I see Abraham. So please, thank you, Abraham.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was very interesting, very enlightening. I wanted to ask you about the relationship that you see throughout this text or in this time between race and gender. So to what extent they are different or the same, or if they have changed over time. There's a view that I find very interesting, very attractive, that says that both gender and race, this is from Sally Haslanger, are exactly the same, and it's just a mechanism of structural oppression between groups. No? So there's no biological ground really that on which we make this difference. It's just like the social structure of a constitutive form of one group having some benefits over another. So yeah, I wanted to ask you, what is the conception of gender within this time that you are revising? And what is its relation with gender? Or if you think it's fair also in a way of trying to understand this literature to use our maybe nowadays understanding of the matter and then apply it there, or how do you also? So I mean, all these things that I'm saying is like what gender is in these texts. How is it conceived? Does it have a relationship with race because you have raised it? And how do you understand that key notion in order to make sense of this corpus of literature? And thanks a lot for your talk. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you, Abraham. I think you picked the question that I think it's the most important for me to think through right now. And it's the question that I'm kind of debating on. So the relationship between race and gender in the writings of the period. This is a very delicate issue because in one sense, Floresta is, she is within a certain social rank in Brazil. When I talk about the so-called Brazilian Enlightenment and those women in the period that were writing in the press, they were all señoras. They were all women that, were heirs of farms that some of them had slaves in their household, right? So this is very delicate issue because it's not the case that the fight for women's rights coexist or is coextensive, let's say, with the abolitionist fight, right? So Charlotte Matthews even considers that because of Floresta's social rank, she can never fully identify with the situation of Black enslaved people and indigenous people. She's writing like from outside. Which is true. She's writing from the outside. She's not indigenous and she's not a Black enslaved woman. But nevertheless, I think she is one women writer of the period who extrapolates this idea that equality is naturally given, and if humans are equal, then it should be the case that equality should happen among races and between gender and within people from different nations. But at the same, so that's one thing. Floresta is very aware of intersectional issues, what we today would call intersectional issues. There's a very important quote from the Opúsculo where she says that she's going to talk about the situation of Brazilian women, and then immediately she modalizes. She says, Brazilian women, what the men of civilization call Brazilian women, not what I consider to be Brazilian women, but what the men of civilization call Brazilian women. That is, non-indigenous women and women and girls who had been brought to civilization, had been saved from slavery on the baptismal sink. So very powerful description of the whole dynamics between races that was happening in 19th century Brazil. So, she's aware that she's not talking about all women when she talks about Brazilian women, right? And at the same time, on her thesis on education as an instrument of emancipation, she's also offering like a moral view of women, like she's sort of writing a moral essay as well, right? So at the end of the opúsculo, we see she's criticizing the customs of Brazilian women of the time and of European women of the time, and kind of forging a new role for women in this kind of emerging sense of nation, right? And in this new role, she is using indigenous women as examples of how women should be like. So she's saying Brazilian women, just like European women, for example, do not raise their kids. They do not breastfeed. They ask others to breastfeed their kids, their newborns. Indigenous women, no, they breastfeed. They're doing the right thing. So she's kind of claiming for the rights of the newborn, and she's advancing this idea that breastfeeding should be a practice held by mothers, by looking at how indigenous culture feels or experiences breastfeeding. So it's very interesting, right? Because I think that when it comes to race and gender and their relationship, we should never make quick generalizations. Like, for example, because Nisia Floresta was a singer, because she was from a social rank, she cannot offer a liberatory thesis that kind of intersects race and gender. And just kind of because I'm here and talking about this, there's another writer of the period called Josefina Álvares de Azevedo. She writes a drama on women's vote in the 19th century, before the suffragist movement in Brazil. Women only started to vote in Brazil in 1930. So this was from 1860s. So she writes this theatrical piece on women's vote, and we have characters that are from different social backgrounds, and one of them is a slave. So there's an enslaved Black woman and an enslaved Black man, and they're discussing women's rights. But Josefina Álvares de Azevedo say, no, but this is not for you. So it's very interesting because you can see all sorts of things going on in the period. But I think that Floresta, with all her limitations because of her social class and lack of firsthand experience with what is it to be an enslaved Black woman, she's trying to forge a theory or a reading of gender and race in a way that encompasses, or in a way that kind of has somehow to include the others, right? Other Brazilian women that are not considered by the civilized man as Brazilian women. I particularly, as you asked as well, I'm not sure what is my stance on what is race with respect to contemporary discussions on race. But maybe this is food for thought, things that I will study later. For now, I think it's very important to see how the abolitionist movement is sort of connected with women's rights movement in this moment before the proclamation of Brazilian Republic. So when in this moment of nation building, abolitionism is tied with, in the work of Floresta specifically, I'm not sure about the others, as I told you, is tied in the works of Floresta. So abolitionism is tied with women's rights. Thank you for the question.
Can I just ask you something very briefly? So maybe as you were talking about this, a way that I was trying to conceive it as a simple question is, what does Floresta think women are? On that basis, is she a woman? And is she writing from a female perspective or from a Cartesian, or maybe the way to interpret it is that she's writing from a Cartesian perspective, or at least that is how it should be analyzed, no? Because she's not trying to write it from a point of view that it's either male or female, and maybe that kind of goes along with your proposal, that she's not taking a stance. She's talking about women, but not as a woman. No? Maybe that's a way of trying to save it and not saying like, oh, well, but it's from her privilege, so she has no stance to say something like this, because in terms of intersectionality, who is she to talk about these issues?
Yeah, so I think that that's the liberatory power of the cogito. And that's what makes Floresta like a practical Cartesian, right? Because if we are thinking beings, then it kind of doesn't matter how our body look like, right? We are thinking beings. And but the key thing here is that we are thinking beings. We should have been treated, we should be treated, subjunctive in English here. So if we are thinking beings, then we should be equal, right? So civil law should treat us equally, but that's not the case. So let's fix the laws to make it. So I think this is that's the Enlightenment period idea that, you know, natural rights and civil rights, and how to build civil rights by recognizing our natural rights, or the relationship between natural and civil rights. So she can also be read within this framework. So yeah, that's how you use the cogito to kind of analyze civil law and culture, and from that perspective, you see what's wrong and what should change, because things are the way they are, not because of nature, not because God wants, or not because of nature, but because, you know, as you said, there was this mechanisms of social oppression that had been created through time, and this can change.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your talk and your answer.
Thanks. Axel, please.
Muchas gracias. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Pugliese. This was very, very, very good. And I hope I'm not asking again Abraham's question, but I was surprised by what you replied to him and the quotes that you presented us, because, for example, especially the quote you gave from page 47, because there it seems like Floresta is not bringing together the colonial plight and the women's fight, because it reads like a whataboutism, right? Like that the colonialism is kind of a pretext for what she wants to talk about, which is about women's rights, right? Because what she says, like, you know, instead of going there conquering and doing all these things, you should care about the education of women. That doesn't seem to be much of a connection between these two things. It's more like, well, you shouldn't be doing this, instead you should be doing that. So it seems very odd that, so my question is whether this was just because of this quote, but in the rest of the book there is a stronger connection, or if there really is not much of a connection between these two issues.
Well, I think that there is a connection between these two issues, in the sense that, you know, colonialism is a structure that organizes injustices, right? So colonialism is a practice that distinguishes people due to their race and gender and nationality, or the territory that they occupy. So, and the colonizers, they sort of construct the subjectivity of the colonized in a sense that, for example, in the case of the indigenous, they feel as if they don't have the power to change something. So the experience of oppression gets ingrained in their subjectivities, right? So colonization. So there are two theses: that colonization is at odds with civilization, and that the level of education of women is a measure of civilization. So Floresta is all the time dealing with this pair of civilization and barbarism, because European thinkers would look to the New World and say that here inhabit barbaric people. So we are the barbarians and they are the civilization. And then she inverts the idea. So she wants to claim that European colonizers, because they colonize, because they oppress women, because they make others suffer, because they depend upon the sort of they depend upon what Sofia says on the translation of Direitos. They depend upon requesting I forgot the word. Submission. They request submission. They request our lower sort of emotions, right? So because they depend upon this request, because they depend upon dominion and an exploitation, then they cannot be called civilized, because civilization is an experience, or should be, in this sense. She's a romantic, right? Civilization is an experience that should recognize, that should be such that everyone can flourish in the community. So Floresta, and with respect to the quote I brought, I thought it was a good quote because it's very explicit about the moral disposition of the Portuguese colonizers. And I think this is important to show, because Floresta is writing for a large audience. She's writing those things on a newspaper, on the capital of the country, right, of the nation at the time. And and she wanted to kind of make others read her. So she was using wit and irony. So sometimes you kind of have to read through the whole book and read other books to kind of understand actually that thing was an irony. So she was gisting. She's talking to people who are actually heirs of Portuguese colonizers, and that are in favor of colonization, and that what Brazil became independent it was after 30 years of Brazilian independence, or a little bit less than that, than when Opúsculo was written. So some people were like, no, we should bring back the Kingdom of Portugal. We should bring back Dom Pedro II, who was the heir of the Kingdom of Portugal, was the Emperor of Brazil. So she's the context in which this quote appears is important, because she wants to poke, to play a little bit with the emotion of her readers. And I think that this is one way in which she does it. She's like, you're proud that you are from one of the most prominent nations in the world right now, the Empire of Portugal, the most important ultramarine empire, who has started the expansion to the old world. But hey, instead of doing that, you should have been caring for women's education. So I think it's part of the rhetoric that is at stake here. But yeah, the idea is to kind of go back to the book and sort of map everywhere where she talks about colonization. I'm teaching Floresta on a graduate course, and I just finished a course on an undergraduate course on Floresta. And my undergraduate students would claim forever that she's only criticizing the Portuguese colonizers, that she's not against colonization in general, just against Portuguese colonization. But I think that they are also lacking this kind of, De Floresta irony, because at some point she's like, see how the United States is right now. There's a different way of colonizing. But I think that this doesn't mean that she's not against colonization per se. I think that she is against. She has to be, otherwise she is not consistent. So the burden is on her. If she wants to be consistent, she has to be against colonization. So that's it. Because of the practical Cartesianism that goes through. So I think that with practical Cartesianism as a lens, we can kind of demand from Floresta certain things and see whether she's answering to it or not, as we do in all kinds of philosophical analysis in different authors. So I think the strategy is just the same.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Efrain?
Thank you. I want to thank you also for a very interesting talk. I learned a lot, not only information, which is also good. I want to ask you two brief questions. They're more like commentaries or petitions to comment on. So about practical Cartesianism. So you made it very clear that for Floresta, practical Cartesianism means something like, well, physical differences are no justification for legal inequality, or something like that. So my question, and this is because it showed at several points of your presentation. I wonder if there's something more than legal equality here, maybe in terms of certain metaphysics of the person or something like that. And because at some point you talked about natural equality. And so I would like you to elaborate on that. And in this same topic, if you know, or if before, after, or during the writings of Floresta, do you know if there were people thinking in a non-Cartesian way, like in a monist way? So the Cartesian argument would make sense against them, and whether they, some of their claims, they're gendered biased or race biased or skin pigmentation biased, whether they were using like monists arguments for inequality. And my last petition to comment is which historiography lessons do you think could be drawn out of this study for philosophical canon, what we call philosophical canon? And well, thanks a lot. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Efrain. These are great questions. With respect to the historiographical lessons, I will start from the last one to the first. I think that the one thing that strikes me the most is that Floresta is not studied by Brazilian philosophers at all. She doesn't figure in the history of Brazilian philosophy, and one reason is because she was not part of the academic discussions. She was not in the seminars. She was not at the universities in Portugal. She was not someone who. So if she were a male, she would be at the University of Coimbra or the University of Lisbon, having her education to sort of come back and do whatever. But that was not the case because she was a woman. So she didn't have access to higher education. So one of the kind of foundational marks of Brazilian philosophy. So if you think in terms of Brazilian philosophy, it starts with Jesuit instruction from the 16th century through the 17th century. And then it shifts with the Marquês de Pombal and the Brazilian Portuguese Enlightenment in the 18th century. It shifts to whatever was happening, the seminars and the law university that had been created in Recife. Places that were not for women, that women could not be part of. So one historiographical lesson is that if we want to see the larger context of philosophy, if we want to hear the dissident voices, not just women's voices, dissident voices in general, we should look for alternative texts, alternative kinds of texts, and texts that had been produced outside of the university setting. So Floresta was writing for the newspapers, and it's very interesting because it's all documented. We go to the National Library of Brazil, the Hemeroteca Digital, so it's all there. We have the documents, and they are on newspapers. So it's important to open space for this kind of research, a research of a philosophical work that it's not a commentary on Aquinas or a commentary on Augustine, but it's like a political perspective on a practical issue, right? So a philosophical perspective on a political issue, a philosophical perspective on a practical issue. So this kind of leads me to the first question, which is practical Cartesianism. So practical Cartesianism is basically using metaphysical and epistemological theses of Descartes, usually from the metaphysics and from the discourse and method, to interpret the social sphere. And it's very important to make this difference between Descartes' view of the political sphere, Descartes' view on the social sphere, Descartes' view on choices and how to act politically, because if you go on the discourses, you have like the maxims, right, for behavior. And it's like you should obey the law when you're not sure what to do. So you should distinguish how Descartes thinks politics and what Cartesianism, that is, what readers of Descartes have done with what he produced metaphysically and epistemologically. And I think that this is very, very important because it kind of frees the idea from the author in one sense. And this is what it strikes me very much, that it was Cartesian ideas, the distinction between mind and body, that sort of created this traction in the public sphere that monist arguments didn't do. I think this is amazing because, and there's an explanation for that, because if you look at the Querelle des Femmes and the beginning of the discussions on the difference between the sexes in 13th century with Bizan, for example, she would try to say that she would continue this idea put forward by Aristotle on the politics, that women has a kind of frail rationality, an imperfect rationality that sort of mirrors its bodily constitution. So women are more fragile, women are more subtle, women are more sensitive, etc. So we should think the virtues, the intellectual virtues of women, that should be different than men's intellectual virtues. So, inequality, physical inequality was sort of part of the argument to justify civil inequality and mental inequality, So inequality was, you recognize physical inequality, and then you conclude that there is also rational inequality, and this inequality should be mirrored in the social and the physical sphere. So it's just, inequality is justified. And then the first moment of the Querelle is one in which women philosopher like Christine de Pizarro He's trying to say, hey, we are different. Hey, we are different, but we have other virtues, and we should be respected because of these different virtues. And then it is because and this shift is shown very beautifully by Dorlan on this, who says that there is this movement of le féminisme logique, this idea of kind of applying logic to the social sphere, such that, you know, arguments from inequality can be destroyed, can be put down. But it's interesting because logical feminism is also, in some sense, a consequence of the openness of people to the idea that the mind is sort of independent from the body, and with respect to our rationality, we are all the same. We can all employ logical abilities or logical capacities equally. And I think that this is something that that was, you know, it's a political consequence of dualism. The question of whether there were monist arguments from women. I don't think that I haven't come across monist arguments from women in 19th century Brazil. Not at all, not yet. Maybe if I continue to look on, you know, those women that were not considered by the men of civilization to be Brazilian women, you know, if we look at the writings of maybe Black enslaved women or Black enslaved men from Brazil or from the time, we can see something of this nature, of this kind, or maybe indigenous writings, I don't know. But if we go to the past, I mean, I do think that Anne Conway, for example, in the 17th century, she was not worried about women's rights, but she offers a metaphysics that is a monist metaphysics that, you know, we can extract, although she didn't talk about in terms of politics, we can extract political consequences of her metaphysical monism, because it's a long story. But yes, we can see monism doing the job in the literature, in 17th century literature. We can see monism doing the job, but it was Cartesianism that sort of spread through the globe and allowed for this kind of argument that today, for 21st century feminists, is sort of outdated, because, you know, contemporary feminists want to argue that the body and the mind are connected. They want to argue from a monist perspective that, you know, the whole idea of embodied cognition and feminist epistemology. So the kind of cognitive experiences that a body has, you know, influences the way we think. So there is that, but it's Floresta, and the idea that, and I think it's a reaction against practical Cartesianism. It's a reaction against Cartesian feminism. Yes, but it's a 21st century reaction, and it's not there. And I think it's important to say that 19th century Latin American Brazilian feminism sort of used the momentum and the inertia of the effects of practical Cartesianism to the fight for women's rights, not necessarily the fight for abolition, although in Floresta we can see that going on. At least this is how I see her writings. I see it there. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. So I have a few questions, if I may, Natasha. And
yes.
Can I ask my questions in Spanish? Is it okay? Okay. So, bueno, primero, algunas preguntas ya las contestaste con la pregunta de Efraín sobre la historiografía. Y creo que tal vez me quedarían dos más. Una es si este papel de Floresta como educadora, ¿no? Y esta estrategia de incorporar en la historia de la filosofía a las mujeres como, no sé si llamarlas filósofas de la educación, es una estrategia más o menos estándar, si tú piensas que es una buena estrategia. Y si tú crees que no tendría tal vez el problema de hacer que haya ciertos temas para filósofas y ciertos temas para filósofos, ¿no? Y ahí tal vez regresaríamos al mismo problema en que los filósofos tocan los grandes temas metafísicos y epistemológicos y las filósofas estos temas que son eso de filósofas, como la filosofía de la educación, la creación de instituciones educativas, etc. Y la segunda pregunta es sobre el término humanitario, ¿no? El opúsculo humanitario, porque yo no sé si este término humanitario equivale en portugués al término humanista. Tal vez en el español de nuestros tiempos no es equivalente porque significan tal vez dos cosas distintas. Estoy pensando en crisis humanitarias ante grandes desastres y en una posición o en una educación humanista que intenta, bueno, justamente integrar, ¿no? Una perspectiva que parte desde estos grandes temas de la educación en la Roma de Cicerón, pasando por el Renacimiento, hasta nuestros proyectos educativos. Entonces quería preguntarte si hay una distinción o habría una distinción en Floresta entre estos dos términos. Gracias.
Gracias, Teresa. Voy a intentar responder en español también. Yo creo que al respecto del papel de Floresta como educadora, la idea de que las mujeres pueden ser filósofas de la educación y de comprender Floresta como una filósofa de educación, si eso no es una estrategia contraria a nuestros intereses de reconocer el papel intelectual de las mujeres en todos los tipos en todas las áreas, en todo del conocimiento. Para esta cuestión, yo creo que hay dos maneras de ver. Una es la cuestión material. Floresta, las mujeres del periodo no tenían acceso a las discusiones de la academia. Entonces, Floresta no podría nunca ser una filósofa de la matemática o de la lógica, porque a no ser que ella tuviese contacto con un tutor o alguna persona que la ha instruido, pero ella no tenía acceso a las discusiones técnicas, entonces ella no podría. Entonces, en el sentido material, ella ha hecho lo que ella ha podido hacer. En un sentido, ella era directora de una escuela, entonces ella estaba ya construyendo un currículo, un proyecto pedagógico de educación para las niñas que incluía cosas para ellas aprender en que no estaba en el currículo tradicional. Entonces yo creo que tenemos que comprender el momento histórico desde la perspectiva histórica, desde la perspectiva de su tiempo. Yo pienso que es por eso, en el sentido historiográfico que Efraín ha preguntado, que tenemos que reconocer, hay un trabajo a ser hecho de reconocer la filosofía de la educación como una disciplina que es importante, que debemos a estudiar, porque es una disciplina que es tradicionalmente asociada a las producciones de las mujeres en la historia. No, eso no es una cosa de Floresta, otras mujeres de la época escribieran tratados educacionales, porque esta era la profesión que era permitida para ellas de ejercer. Entonces yo creo que en el contexto material histórico, esto es una lección que tenemos que traer para los días de hoy, como no de disminuir Floresta por ser una filósofa de educación, pero de engrandecer la filosofía de educación para que otras como Floresta puedan mostrar su voz, como por ejemplo Juana Manso en Argentina, también hay una historia semejante. Sí, y en un sentido teórico, claro, las mujeres deben, el esfuerzo es para que las mujeres tengan los más diversos espacios en la filosofía, en la universidad, en la ciencia, en la sociedad en general, ¿no? A respecto del sentido de humanitario, en el título de opúsculo humanitario, yo no sabía, yo no había pensado en este sentido de crisis humanitaria como una crisis humanitaria. Yo pienso que es más este sentido que un sentido humanista en el sentido renacentista, porque, pero no sé, porque en one hand, ella está esperando, queriendo enseñar Cícero, los latinos, la literatura latina clásica para las niñas, pero de otro lado, él está queriendo hablar de un sentido de educación que devuelve la dignidad en el sentido humano, en la humanidad de aquellos que han tenido su humanidad como que secuestrada por la colonización y por el patriarcado y por la esclavitud. Esclavidón. Perdón, mi portuñol.
Muchas gracias. Sí, perfecto. Muchas gracias, Natasja. ¿Ángeles?
Gracias. Natasja, te voy a preguntar en español, pero contesta como quieras. Y tiene que ver con lo que te decía Tere y con lo que te decía Efraín, que realmente me quedé pensando un poco si realmente como que vale la pena caracterizarla como filósofa de la educación, o la idea misma de que es filósofa de la educación ya es una idea que responde más a nuestra manera de concebir la filosofía hoy día, ¿no? Como la filosofía partida en estas áreas, ¿no? Tan claramente delimitadas, que además eso tiene como un carácter también súper histórico, cómo se han ido delimitando las áreas de la filosofía, ¿no? Y que de hecho creo yo que hoy día está incluso en duda que eso se pueda hacer de esa manera. Y por otro lado, me parece súper interesante cuando hablabas de las lecciones historiográficas que uno puede sacar, porque creo que hay algo que incluso quizá, pero te pregunto, se podría generalizar, y es que no solo tenemos que revisar las fuentes de la filosofía, es decir, no solo tenemos que ir a los periódicos, hay un montón de fuentes que no están disponibles en la academia, ¿no? Para saber realmente qué se hizo la filosofía, sino que quizá también tenemos que revisar la idea misma que tenemos acerca de qué es la filosofía, ¿no? Porque en general se nos enseña a pensar que la filosofía es lo que se hace en la academia, ¿no? Y el pensamiento que está fuera de ella es como, me recordó una discusión que había, que en algún momento escribieron sobre ello en México, Lenkersdorf y Luis Villoro. Y entonces Lenkersdorf defendía que el pensamiento maya era una filosofía, y Luis Villoro decía que no era una filosofía, que era un pensamiento muy interesante, pero que no era. Y después Villoro se retractó de lo que dijo y defendió lo contrario, pero la discusión fue muy interesante porque me parece que hay que inclusive la concepción misma de lo que es la filosofía es historizable, es histórica, ¿no? Y que quizá en parte este tipo de estudios nos pueda llevar a revisar no solo el papel de las mujeres en la filosofía, sino inclusive nuestra manera de pensar acerca de las fuentes y de la filosofía misma. Entonces, no sé qué piensas acerca de esto.
Interesante, Ángeles. En primer lugar, sobre la filosofía de la educación, yo creo que sería muy incongruente y anacrónico de llamar Floresta de teórica crítica o cualquier cosa en este sentido, porque lo que Floresta hace es una filosofía de la cultura. Él escribe jornales de viaje, analiza toda la situación de la Europa, porque ella vive en Europa durante 30 años. Ella muere en Francia. Entonces, ella pasa mucho tiempo de su vida como que haciendo análisis culturales, también escritos morales sobre el modo como las mujeres se comportan, tanto en Brasil como en Europa. Cuando vemos su obra desde esa perspectiva completa, su obra completa, no podemos dejar de decir que ella es una filósofa de educación, porque hay muchos escritos morales, en el senso de ella como que creando un sentido, un rol, un papel para las mujeres en la sociedad, y él dice, son sus propias palabras, que su mayor interés es en la educación de las mujeres. Entonces, la educación es una gran cosa para ella. Y yo creo que, como decía Teresa, no es una cuestión de disminuir Floresta porque es una filósofa de educación, pero como pensamos a la filosofía de educación para engrandecer Floresta. No veo problema en llamarla como una filósofa de la educación, dado que hay mucho más que eso. Ella ofrece una crítica cultural, ella tiene conocimiento de tesis metafísicas, no mucho epistemológicas, pero metafísicas sí, porque el cristianismo es también una gran influencia en su pensamiento. Es una página de la historia que no ha tocado aquí, pero ella es una teórica del cristianismo también. Él critica la institución cristiana en Brasil, él denuncia abusos sexuales de padres en Brasil. Entonces es un cristianismo que no es muy... Él valoriza las clarisas descalzas, una orden de mujeres humanitarias, no sé. Entonces... c'est ça. Il y a beaucoup de choses. Floresta es una floresta. Hay una gran cantidad de temas que están allá para ser estudiados. A respecto de el trabajo de reflexión sobre el canon, nos hacer pensar lo que es la filosofía, para mí, personalmente, no es exactamente lo que es la filosofía, porque yo creo que cada uno que hace el trabajo de reflexión canónica parte de un lugar que tiene que asumir como un lugar que no es necesariamente el mejor, que no es necesariamente el correcto. Y yo pienso que yo tengo que asumir que yo sé un poco lo que es la filosofía, para reconocer la filosofía en las cosas. Entonces, para mí, yo pienso que la cuestión que se pone no es exactamente lo que es la filosofía, pero ¿quién puede hacer la filosofía? ¿Quién hace filosofía? Y yo pienso que ¿y cómo? Pero no lo que es, pero cómo y quién. Y yo pienso que cuando preguntamos cómo y quién, y si nos respondemos que, bueno, diversas personas de diversas maneras, entonces nuestro olhar, nuestras lunetas filosóficas pueden capturar una gran cantidad de cosas. Eso es un poco de la filosofía ser una cosa que es completamente ajena de las cosas que yo he estudiado o que yo he leído. Yo pienso que la filosofía, bueno, yo no voy a responder aquí en algunos minutos lo que es la filosofía, pero yo pienso que es importante de abrir nuestra perspectiva al respecto de cómo la filosofía se expresa, quién hace, porque, bueno, y yo creo que eso es la democratización de la filosofía, eso es reconocer la filosofía en diversos lugares, que puede ser hecha por una cantidad de personas inmensa. Yo tengo un compañero de trabajo, Ulises Piñero, que reconoce filosofía en las historias contadas por una catadora de basura en Río. Entonces, estos tipos de cosas, la catadora de basura, los indígenas en sus poemas, sus cantos, sus cartas, los romances escritos por manos negras en el Brasil del siglo XIX, en una miríade de formas, pero es la filosofía. Yo no quiero negociar un sentido largo de filosofía que une todas esas cosas en una tradición que es histórica y que puede ser académica también, porque, no sé, yo me siento también como responsable por proteger un legado histórico, porque si paramos de hablar de Platón, ninguém más va a hablar de Platón. Platón desaparecerá. No quiero parar de hablar de Platón, yo quiero hablar de Platón, de Descartes, de Floresta, y de la catadora de basura.
Gracias, sí, perfecto.
Sí, muchas gracias, Natasja. No sé si haya alguna otra pregunta, y si no es así, podríamos concluir la sesión de hoy. Muchísimas gracias, Natasja, creo que fue una excelente plática, y muchas gracias por la discusión. Nos vemos.